The portal did not open with the grinding shriek of alien technology or the ceremonial flash of a sorcerer's ring. It opened the way as soap bubble pops, a soft, apologetic little collapse of light above Fifth Avenue, gone almost before anyone looked up. And out of it fell a man in a yellow jumpsuit, red gloves, and a white cape, tumbling through the New York sky like a discarded action figure thrown from a rooftop. He did not scream. He did not brace for impact. He looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced, the way a man looks when he realizes he's left the stove on. He hit the pavement outside a bodega on 43rd Street hard enough to crater the sidewalk 6 inches deep in a perfect circle, sending a spiderweb of cracks radiating out into the crosswalk and up the side of a parked delivery truck which rocked onto 2 wheels before slamming back down. Glass rained from 3 storefronts. A hot dog cart flipped. Pigeons detonated off the awnings in every direction like the block itself had exhaled them. For a full 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the tourists started screaming because in this city that is a load-bearing tradition, and a bike courier skidded sideways into a mailbox trying not to look and looked anyway. The man in yellow stood up. He rolled his neck once, examined a scuff mark on his glove with real disapproval, and looked around at the crater, the broken glass, the overturned hot dog cart with visible sausages rolling into the gutter, and said, to no one in particular, in a voice so flat it sounded almost bored, "Excuse me. Where's the nearest supermarket?" 3 blocks away, in a converted brownstone with a door that measured its visitors more carefully than any metal detector ever could. Alarms that had not gone off in 14 months came alive all at once. Not the kind that wailed. The other kind, the kind that made grown heroes put down their coffee. Tony Stark's tablet lit up mid-sentence, cutting off a call he was having about vibranium tariffs. And the first thing on the screen wasn't a threat assessment. It was a null result, a big blinking categorically empty null result, the kind Friday only produced when the censors had a question they didn't know how to ask. "Boss," Friday said, "I have an energy signature over Midtown that isn't one." "That's not a sentence," Tony said, already walking. "It's the most accurate one I've got. Something hit the street with enough kinetic force to register on 3 continents worth of seismographs, and the only readable signature is baseline human. No radiation. No arc reactor bleed, no mystical residue, no cosmic background noise. It's like something threw a car at the pavement, except the car is a guy and the guy is nothing." That got him moving faster than any of the words that usually did. Tony had spent a decade cataloging every flavor of impossible New York had ever produced: gamma-soaked rage, Asgardian lightning, borrowed Pym particles, stolen infinity stones, and every single one of them left a signature. A fingerprint, a cause. Nothing was not a category he had a folder for. 2 miles uptown, Bruce Banner felt it differently. He felt it the way he felt everything that mattered, which was to say, in the part of his chest that didn't belong entirely to him anymore. A low, animal hum, not fear exactly, more like recognition, the sense you get standing at the top of a cliff, not because you're going to jump, but because some old, stupid part of your brain is doing the math on what would happen if you did. "Something's wrong," he said to nobody in a lab that had been quiet 10 seconds earlier. He was in the passenger seat of a Quinjet within 4 minutes, still buttoning a shirt he hadn't planned on needing today, next to Natasha Romanoff, who was reading the same nonsensical sensor data on a tablet and liking it less with every line. "No radiological signature," she said. "No metahuman gene marker, no magical resonance. You know what normally reads like this?" "What?" "Nothing. Nothing reads like this." By the time the Quinjet cleared the Hudson, the man in yellow had already been asked, by 6 different terrified New Yorkers, whether he was okay, whether he needed a doctor, and whether he was filming something for YouTube, to which he'd answered no, no, and "What's YouTube?" respectively in the same flat, unbothered tone each time. He was currently standing in the middle of the crater he'd made, turning in a slow circle, squinting at street signs that read names he had never once encountered in a language he somehow understood perfectly. "Metropolis," he muttered. "No, this isn't Metropolis." He looked down at the crater beneath his boots, at the spiderwebbed concrete, at the mailbox someone had helpfully already labeled with a hasty piece of cardboard reading "Do not touch police," and sighed the particular sigh of a man who has had this exact morning before in a different city with a different name on the street signs. "Another one," he said. "Great." Quinjet's shadow crossed the block first. Then the jet itself, engines screaming down into a hover 30 feet above the crater, kicking loose newspaper and hot dog cart napkins into a small localized hurricane. The ramp dropped before it had fully stopped, and Natasha came down at first, weapon low but ready, Bruce a step behind her with the careful stillness of a man counting his own heartbeat. "Sir," Natasha said, projecting her voice without shouting, the tone she used on things that might be bombs, might be people, might be both. "I need you to stay exactly where you are." Man in yellow looked at her, then at the gun, then with an expression of profound and genuine confusion back at his own hands as though trying to work out what about a bald man standing in a hole could possibly warrant a firearm. "Not doing anything," he said. "You just fell out of the sky and put a 12-foot crater in 5th Avenue, Natasha said. 43rd. "What? It's 43rd Street, he said. "Not 5th Avenue, that's 2 blocks over." He said this the way a man corrects a minor factual error on a form he's filling out, entirely without heat, entirely without noticing that this was perhaps not the detail anyone in this conversation was focused on. Bruce, despite everything, felt his mouth twitch. There was something profoundly disarming about a man who fell through a hole in reality, cratered a street, and immediately became a stickler for municipal geography. "What's your name?" Bruce asked, stepping up beside Natasha, hands visibly empty, voice pitched low and careful. The voice he used on frightened things, on things that might break if handled wrong, though something told him this particular thing was not going to be the one that broke. "Saitama," the man said. "Saitama, okay, do you know where you are?" "No," Saitama admitted. "Do you know where the nearest supermarket is? There was a sale on cabbage that ends today. And I really don't want to miss it a second time." Bruce opened his mouth, found no follow-up question adequate to that sentence, and closed it again. That was the moment Hulk arrived. He didn't arrive quietly. He never did. The transformation had already been building in the back of Bruce's skull since the moment they'd cleared the Hudson, that low animal hum sharpening into something with teeth. And when Natasha's radio crackled with Steve Rogers' voice saying they had a possible hostile situation and requesting backup, something in Bruce's control slipped half an inch, which for the other guy was more than enough room to work with. The change took 4 seconds. It always did. Clothes tearing, the low rolling thunder of a ribcage rebuilding itself at speed, green skin unfolding over the wreck of a man who had, until 4 seconds ago, been mid-sentence about cabbage. And when it was done, 7 feet of pure engineered rage stood where Bruce Banner had been, and it looked with total and uncomplicated hostility at the stranger in the crater. "Threat," Hulk said, which was as close to a diagnosis as the Hulk's vocabulary generally ran. Natasha stepped back. "Not out of fear, out of professional courtesy, the kind you extend to a landslide." Saitama looked up at 7 feet of green muscle with the same expression he'd give a delivery notice he hadn't ordered. "Oh," he said. "Hi." Hulk swung. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the more devastating punches in the recorded history of the Avengers, a full torque-loaded haymaker that had on separate occasions cratered buildings, dented a Chitauri Leviathan's skull, and once sent Thor himself skidding 400 feet across a frozen lake. It came in at a speed the human eye had no business tracking, aimed squarely at Saitama's jaw. Saitama caught it, not blocked, not deflected. Caught it, one gloved hand closing around Hulk's fist the way you'd catch a beach ball tossed a little too hard by a kid at a barbecue, and simply stopped it there, midair, 3 inches from his own face, without so much as shifting his footing in the crater beneath him. The sound of that stop rolled down the block like a thunderclap in reverse, every window within 100 feet cracking at once from the compression wave, car alarms detonating in a chain reaction up and down the street. A pigeon 3 stories up simply ceasing to be a pigeon and becoming a small cloud of feathers. Hulk stared at his own fist, held motionless in the grip of a bald man in yellow pajamas, with an expression that on that particular face was almost never seen: surprise. "Careful," Saitama said mildly. "You could hurt somebody doing that." He said it without irony. He said it the way you tell a large, well-meaning dog to watch its tail near the good vase. There was no boast in it, no triumph, not even the faint satisfaction of a man who has just done something remarkable. He genuinely, simply meant it as advice. Hulk roared and swung with the other fist. Saitama caught that one too in the other hand, and now stood holding both of Hulk's fists like a man holding the leashes of 2 very large, very confused dogs, his boots not so much as sliding an inch in the rubble. Natasha's voice, calm as ever over comms, had lost about 30% of its calm. "Cap, I need eyes on 43rd Street right now. We have a containment situation and I do not currently understand what we're containing." That was when Thor landed. He came down out of a sky that had, 5 seconds earlier, been merely overcast, and was now, very abruptly, the color of a fresh bruise, streaked with lightning that hadn't asked anyone's permission to exist. Mjolnir hit the pavement first, driving a second crater 6 feet from the first one, the shockwave alone knocking Natasha off her feet and flattening what remained of the hot dog cart into something resembling abstract art. Enough, Thor said in the voice reserved for gods and television announcers, and stepped between Hulk and the stranger with his hammer raised. Whatever you are, you will cease this. He got no further because Saitama, without appearing to move with any particular hurry, released Hulk's fists, turned, and punched him. There is no good way to describe what that punch looked like from the outside, because from the outside it did not look like anything. There was no wind-up. There was no visible arc. There was simply Thor, mid-sentence, hammer raised, and then there was Thor 400 meters downrange, embedded to the shoulders in the side of a parking garage that had, until that moment, held 12 floors of parked cars, 6 of which were now visible through the new hole and none of which were staying where they'd been left. The sound arrived a full second and a half after the punch itself, a boom that rolled down 43rd Street and rattled every window for 6 blocks. Followed by the slow, grinding collapse of 3 parking levels folding in on themselves like a house of cards, exhaling silence for a moment, except for the settling dust and one lone, extremely committed car alarm. Saitama lowered his fist, looked at where Thor had been standing, and frowned, the first real expression to cross his face all morning, more troubled than anything else. He said. That was weird, Hulk demanded, still standing there, still holding the ghost shape of the punches he hadn't thrown yet. He wasn't really trying to hit me, Saitama said, mostly to himself, staring down the block at the ruined garage with genuine puzzlement. I could tell that was a warning shot. Big guy in a cape wasn't actually going for the kill. He scratched the back of his bald head. I don't usually get warning shots. Usually people are trying pretty hard by the second hit. He said this the way a man might note that the weather had been unseasonably mild, a small, curious observation filed away of no great personal weight. He did not seem to register that he had just launched a god through a parking structure. He seemed to be turning over with mild interest, the novelty of an opponent who hadn't been trying to kill him. From 400 meters away, buried to the shoulders in rebar and concrete dust, Thor pulled himself free of the wreckage with a grunt, shook out his cape, retrieved Mjolnir from where it had skittered into a stairwell, and stood there for a long moment simply staring back down the street at the small man in the crater. He had been hit harder than this. Rarely, never quite like this. Because that was the thing that stopped him from charging back in, hammer crackling, the way every instinct in his 1,000-year-old body was screaming at him to do. It hadn't hurt the way a real blow hurt. There had been no malice in it, no killing intent, no weight of an enemy trying to end him. It had felt disorientingly almost gentle, a shove disguised as a punch, delivered by someone who had clearly, plainly held back, which was so much worse in its way than if it had actually hurt. Because if that was Saitama holding back, Thor did not particularly want to find out what he looked like when he wasn't. High above, unnoticed by everyone on the ground, a thin seam had opened in the sky over Manhattan, not a portal, not quite, more like a hairline crack in a windshield, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and precisely what you were looking for. It widened by perhaps a millimeter, and then, as if satisfied, closed again. Somewhere, something that was not a person, and had not been a person for longer than the concept of Manhattan had existed, watched the punch land, watched Thor go through concrete and steel like paper, and felt, for the first time in longer than it could measure, something that might, in a being capable of such things, have been called anticipation. It had been searching a very long time for exactly this. A being with no ceiling, no source to sever, no limit to find. It had found him. Back on 43rd Street, sirens were closing in from 6 directions, a police perimeter trying and failing to form around a crater full of a green rage monster, a very confused superhero, and a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who had just turned to Hulk, tilted his head and asked with total sincerity, seriously though, supermarket, any of you know one around here? The Sanctum Sanctorum's front door had never enjoyed a reputation for punctuality, but on this particular afternoon it opened before Tony Stark had finished knocking, which was in itself a bad sign. Stephen Strange rarely bothered with doors he could simply be waiting behind. You felt it too, Tony said, not a question. I felt something try to happen and then not finish happening, Strange said, already turning and walking back into the house, cloak trailing him like a held breath. "'Tis worse, come in, quickly, I don't like leaving the wards down longer than I have to." By the time they reached the study, a room stacked floor to ceiling with texts that predated most of Earth's written languages, Strange had already conjured 3 floating rings of golden light, each one slowly rotating through a different spectrum of analysis, none of which were producing results he liked. "Talk to me," Tony said. "I scanned him the moment the tier opened," Strange said, "before he even hit the ground. Habit, you learn to check the seams the second they show up uninvited." He gestured and the rings resolved into a rough silhouette, a man-shaped void outlined in gold with nothing at all inside it. "This is what I got. That's not a scan, that's a blank. That's what I said, so I checked again and again. I've run every diagnostic this sanctum is capable of running, and I want you to understand what I'm telling you, Stark, because I don't say it often. I have never seen this before." Strange closed his fist and the rings collapsed. No radiation signature, no genetic anomaly, no trace of any of the 9 realms' energy signatures, no chi, no ectoplasmic residue, no soul forge resonance, nothing that would suggest extremis, superserum, cosmic ray exposure, gamma bombardment, or divine bloodline. I have checked for all of them. Twice. "What is he?" "That's the problem," Strange said, and for the first time since Tony had known him, the man looked genuinely, quietly unsettled. "By every metric I have, he isn't anything. He's just a man. A completely, entirely ordinary man who happens to be able to do what he just did to Thor." Down on 43rd Street, the ordinary man in question was currently sitting on the lip of his own crater, elbows on his knees, watching 6 different NYPD officers argue with each other about jurisdiction while a Hulk-sized Bruce Banner shrunk back down somewhere in the last 10 minutes to a rumpled, exhausted-looking man wrapped in an emergency blanket someone had thrown over him, sat a few feet away, sipping a coffee someone else had produced from somewhere. Because apparently that was standard operating procedure after a code green. "You want one?" Bruce asked, holding out a second cup that had appeared at his elbow without explanation. New York produced coffee for its disasters the way other cities produced casualty reports. Saitama took it, sniffed it, drank it in one go like a shot of something stronger. "Thanks," he said. "Sorry about your friend, the Cape one." "Thor," Bruce said. "He's fine." He's probably better than fine. He's probably down at that garage right now trying to figure out how to bring it up at the next team meeting without sounding like he's bragging that he got hit that hard and survived," Saitama said. "He seemed nice for a warning shot." "You keep saying that, warning shot. Wasn't trying to actually hit me," Saitama said, staring off down the block at the wrecked garage with the same faint, puzzled frown from before. "I could feel it. Like, you know how sometimes you can tell someone's just testing you? Feeling you out, seeing what you'll do without really committing. That's what that was. First time in a long time somebody's done that instead of just going for the kill right off." He turned the empty coffee cup over in his hands. "Kind of nice, actually. Most places I show up, people don't bother with the test." Bruce studied him. There was something in the way Saitama said it, flat, unbothered, but with a strange undertow beneath the flatness. The particular exhaustion of a man describing a commute he'd made 10,000 times and stopped noticing the scenery of. "Most places I show up. Not this place, most places." "Many places have you shown up?" Bruce asked carefully. "Exactly." Saitama thought about it. Actually thought about it, counting on gloved fingers, losing track somewhere around 6, starting over. "A lot," he said finally. "I stopped keeping count around the 3rd universe. It gets repetitive. New sky, new enemies, everybody's real strong until they're not, and then somebody asks me to save their world and I do, and then a couple weeks later I fall through another hole in the sky and it starts over." He looked at the coffee cup. "This is at least the first one with decent coffee." Bruce opened his mouth to say something, he wasn't sure what. Some combination of "that's insane" and "that's the saddest thing I've heard all week," and "are you saying this has happened before," when a shadow crossed overhead, and a very specific, very familiar voice cut in from somewhere above the crater. "Okay, so question," the voice said, dropping down from a fire escape in a red and blue blur, landing in a crouch on a mailbox that groaned in protest. "And I want to preface this by saying I've had a really weird week already, so my bar for weird is genuinely pretty high right now, but did that guy just punch Thor into a parking garage? Because from where I was swinging it looked like Thor just went into a parking garage." Peter Parker, because it was unmistakably Peter Parker, mask rolled halfway up his face so he could talk without the fabric bunching against his mouth. Hair sticking up at 3 different angles from being crammed under the suit all day. Hopped down off the mailbox and approached the crater with the loose-limbed, unbothered curiosity of someone who had genuinely seen weirder. "That's the guy," Bruce confirmed. Peter looked at Saitama. Saitama looked back at him with the mild, unhurried attention of a man watching a bus arrive that he had no particular opinion on. "Hi," Peter said. "I'm okay. Normally I'd do the whole friendly neighborhood bit, but honestly you just punched a god into a building, so I feel like we can skip the small talk. You're not like evil, are you? Because I've had a day and I really don't have it in me for evil today," Saitama said. Cool, great. That tracks. You don't really give off evil energy, you kind of give off guy waiting for a bus energy, no offense." "None taken," Saitama said. "That's pretty accurate actually." Something in the exchange made Bruce's mouth twitch again the second time today, which was itself a small miracle, given that Bruce Banner did not, as a rule, find much funny about days that started with a code green. There was an ease to it he hadn't expected. Watching this kid who talked in run-on sentences banter with a man who apparently didn't know how to lower his voice below dead flat, and something about the mismatch worked in a way Bruce couldn't quite articulate. "Peter Parker," Peter said, sticking out a hand. "Saitama," Saitama said, shaking it. His grip, apparently by long habit, was carefully, deliberately gentle, the grip of a man who had learned, somewhere down a long line of universes, exactly how much pressure a normal hand could survive, and who applied precisely that much and not a fraction more. "So, real talk," Peter said, dropping onto the crater's edge next to him, entirely unbothered by the fact that half the NYPD's finest were currently trying to figure out whether to arrest him too. "What's your deal?" "Because I've fought aliens, I've fought a guy with actual sand powers, I fought a dude with wings made of vulture parts, and none of them looked like they just wandered out of a laundromat. No offense to the suit. It's a hero suit," Saitama said, with the faint, injured dignity of a man who had had this exact conversation before in other universes and lost every time. "I ordered it from a website, it was cheap. It's very yellow." "I know." "I like it," Peter said generously in the tone of someone trying to salvage a conversation he'd derailed. "So what are you like, Superman? Are you from a different planet? Because I've met one of those too. Actually, long story, she's really nice, she could probably bench press a submarine." "I'm from Earth," Saitama said. "Just not this one, there's a lot of them I guess. This is at least the fourth I've ended up in." Peter's eyebrows went up. "Multiverse guy, okay, we get those. We had a whole thing with a multiverse a while back, very stressful, do not recommend." He tilted his head, genuinely curious now instead of performatively curious, in the specific way of a kid who had learned the hard way that the universe kept getting stranger and had decided the only sane response was enthusiasm. "So how'd you get here? Machine spell, did somebody like summon you?" "Portal," Saitama said. "Just opened up, I was on my way to the store." "For cabbage," Saitama said with the weary gravity of a man discussing a genuine tragedy. "There was a sale, I think I missed it now." Peter looked at him for a long moment, clearly trying to work out whether this was a joke and clearly deciding from Saitama's face that it was not remotely a joke, and that this was, somehow, the single most sincere grievance the man had expressed since arriving. I'm sorry, that's genuinely the saddest thing I've heard today, and today involved parking garage rubble," Peter said, and there was real warmth under the joke, the kind that came easy to him, the kind Bruce had noticed before in kids who'd had too much taken from them too young and had decided stubbornly to stay kind about it anyway. "Tell you what. Cabbage sale's probably over, but there's a bodega 2 blocks from here that does this incredible egg sandwich, and I feel like after the morning you've had, you've earned an egg sandwich. My treat? Well, May's treat, technically, she doesn't know it yet, but she'll be fine with it." Saitama looked at him. Something in his flat, unbothered expression shifted, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just a small loosening around the eyes. The particular relief of a man who has fallen through dozens of dimensional rifts, fought dozens of universes' strongest, and been offered, for what felt like the first time in longer than he could count, something as simple and as human as a sandwich from someone who wasn't asking him to save the world first. "Yeah," Saitama said. "Okay." 3 blocks north, in the reinforced conference room that the Avengers had, with characteristic lack of imagination, simply started calling the Situation Room, the mood was considerably less friendly. "I'm saying we contain him," said a man in a dark suit who represented, depending on who you asked, either the Department of Damage Control or several federal agencies simultaneously, seated at the far end of the table with the flat, unbothered confidence of someone who'd spent a career treating superhumans as line items. "You have a subject who no-sold a Hulk transformation and put Thor through a building. I don't care what your scans say, Dr. Strange, nothing is not a threat classification I can put in a report. Didn't attack anyone," Steve Rogers said, arms crossed, standing rather than sitting the way he did when a conversation was heading somewhere he didn't like. "Thor and Hulk attacked him. From what I've heard, he held back. Significantly. That's exactly my point, Captain. A man who can hold back that much force isn't someone we get to assess after the fact. We assess him now in a controlled environment, or we find out the hard way what happens when he stops holding back." Asked about a grocery sale, Natasha said dryly, scrolling through a tablet full of witness statements. "In the middle of the incident, twice, I've profiled a lot of dangerous men and I've never had one open with produce. That could be a tactic. Could also just be a guy who wanted cabbage," Natasha said, not looking up. Across the table, Dr. Strange had said very little, which was, for those who knew him, its own kind of alarm. He sat with his fingers steepled, staring at a point on the table that wasn't really there, running the scan results over and over in his head, looking for the seam he knew had to exist and couldn't find. "There's something else," he said finally, and the room quieted because Strange rarely spoke unless it mattered. I said his power reads as nothing, that's true, but something did read. Just not on him, meaning, Tony asked. The tear that brought him here wasn't natural, Strange said. I've seen natural dimensional ruptures, the Bifrost leaves one kind of scar, cosmic level events leave another, even the reality stone leaves something behind if you know where to look. This didn't leave a scar, it left a seam, deliberately closed, deliberately clean. He looked up and there was something in his eyes that made even Tony sit up straighter. Somebody opened that door. And somebody closed it very carefully behind him, the way you close a door on a room you don't want anyone walking into by accident. Silence settled over the table. So he wasn't an accident, Steve said slowly. I don't think he was ever meant to arrive quietly, Strange said. I think whatever brought him here wanted us to see exactly what he could do, and I think it's still watching to see what we do next. Back at the bodega, unaware that he had just become the subject of a federal threat assessment 3 blocks away, Saitama sat on an overturned milk crate outside the front window, working through the largest egg sandwich Peter had ever personally witnessed a human being order. While Peter perched on the crate beside him, mask fully off now, radiating the easy, unguarded curiosity of a teenager who had decided, against considerable evidence to the contrary, that the universe kept handing him interesting people instead of just disasters. Okay, but for real, Peter said around a bite of his own sandwich. If you've been to 3 other universes before this one, did you fight like versions of the Avengers there too? Is there a universe where I'm like evil? Please say there's a universe where I'm evil, that would be so cool. I don't know, Saitama admitted. I mostly fought whatever was strongest, didn't always meet everybody. He chewed, swallowed, considered the question with more genuine thought than he'd given anything since he'd landed. One time there was a green guy, big, angry, similar to your friend actually, except this one didn't turn back. Oh, that's okay, that's a whole different vibe, Peter said. Different multiverse rules, probably. Some of these hulks don't come back. It's kind of a whole thing. There's a chart, I could show you the chart. I don't need a chart, Saitama said, but there was something almost fond in the flatness now, the particular deadpan warmth of a man who, 3 universes deep into an endless string of arrivals and departures, had forgotten what it felt like to just talk to somebody about nothing in particular. You ask a lot of questions. Yeah, sorry, it's a thing I do. Aunt May says it's a coping mechanism, Peter said, entirely unbothered by the observation. But like for real though, being the strongest guy wherever you go, that's gotta be, I don't know, lonely. I fight stuff that's way stronger than me constantly and it's terrifying, but at least I've got people. You said you keep landing places and saving them and then leaving. Do you ever stay? Saitama went quiet for a moment. It was the longest pause he did all day, longer than the pause before he'd hit Thor, longer than the pause before he'd asked about the supermarket. He looked down at the remains of his sandwich, at the crater 3 blocks south still being cordoned off by yellow tape, at the ordinary, unbothered rhythm of a city that had already mostly moved past the disaster and gone back to its lunch orders. No, he said finally. Never really works out that way. Something always comes up. Bigger threat, new universe. I go where I'm needed, I guess, and then I keep going. That sucks, Peter said with the blunt, unfiltered honesty of someone young enough not to have learned to soften things yet. Yeah, Saitama agreed, and for the first time since he'd fallen out of the sky, he sounded almost tired instead of flat. It does, kind of. Above them, in a sky that had gone back to ordinary gray-blue, nothing visible marked the thin seam that had opened and closed hours earlier. But 3 miles up, past the range of any satellite Tony Stark had ever launched, something without a face and without a name watched the two of them sitting on a milk crate outside a bodega, sharing a sandwich, and filed the moment away with the same cold, patient interest it gave everything. Not because it cared about sandwiches or friendships or the particular ache of a man who had saved 100 worlds and never once been allowed to stay in one. It cared because it had learned, across a very long study of very many universes, that the things a being loved were always, eventually, the most efficient way to make that being do exactly what you needed. And it had all the time in creation to be patient. By the time the sun set on Saitama's first day in this universe, he had been offered in no particular order. Government consulting contract, a provisional Avengers trial membership, a research fellowship at a facility he was assured he would find extremely comfortable, and from a representative of an organization that declined to identify itself beyond a business card reading simply the collectors in embossed silver lettering, an amount of money that made even Tony Stark's eyebrows climb when he heard about it secondhand. Saitama had turned down all 4 before finishing his second egg sandwich. I don't want a job, he told Steve Rogers, who had come down personally to make the Avengers pitch, reasoning correctly that Captain America showing up in person carried more weight than a memo. I had a job, hero for fun then hero for hire when the fun ran out and I needed rent money. I'm not doing the whole license and oversight thing again. Last time I did that there was a lot of paperwork and almost none of it was about the actual heroics. This wouldn't be like that, Steve said, though even he sounded slightly unconvinced by his own pitch, having sat through enough damage control briefings that week to know exactly how much paperwork was in fact coming. We just want to understand what you are, what you can do, so we can help if you need it and so you don't get treated like a threat every time you step outside. I don't need help, Saitama said, not unkindly, just factually the way a man states his shoe size. I've never needed help, that's kind of the problem. Steve didn't have a good answer for that. Nobody had so far. It was, Bruce had noted quietly to Natasha over coffee that afternoon, the strangest thing about the whole situation. Every other overwhelming threat New York had produced wanted something. Power, revenge, conquest, understanding, a cure, a home. Saitama wanted a competent produce section and apparently to be left roughly alone. Which made him, in the specific and paranoid language of federal risk assessment, the single most concerning individual anyone in that building had cataloged in a decade. A man who wants nothing is a man you can't negotiate with, the damage control representative said again, for what Tony estimated was the fourth time that day, in a private strategy session held 2 floors above the Situation Room, attended by exactly the people the man trusted to actually solve problems instead of file them. You can't offer him money, you can't offer him status. You can't threaten someone he loves because as far as we can tell he doesn't have anyone in this universe to threat. That is not stability, Mr. Stark. That is a bomb with no fuse we can find. He's not a bomb, Tony said. He's a guy who wanted an egg sandwich. Put a 9 Realms native through a parking structure. Thor swung a hammer at him first, Natasha said, not looking up from her tablet. I've read the report 6 times. He initiated nothing. He responded, and he responded with what reads from every witness account like the absolute minimum force required to end the exchange. If he wanted this city gone, it would already be gone. That's not a threat profile, that's the opposite of one. With respect, Agent Romanoff, the opposite of a threat isn't a category my superiors accept in a briefing. Then your superiors should update their categories, Natasha said, because I don't think this one's going to fit the old ones. Dr. Strange, seated at the head of the table with the particular stillness of a man doing several kinds of math at once, finally spoke. I'd be less concerned with whether he's a threat, he said, and more concerned with who thinks he's a resource. Because I promise you whoever tore that hole open didn't do it out of curiosity, and they will not be the only interested party for long. He was, as it turned out, exactly right, and considerably faster than even he expected. 3 miles below the city, in a converted subway maintenance depot that had over the years quietly become something considerably stranger than its blueprints suggested, a woman with silver-white hair and a laboratory coat that cost more than most people's cars stood before a bank of monitors replaying, frame by frame, the footage of Thor's flight into the parking garage. Dr. Ophelia Sarkov had built her reputation and her fortune cataloging the anomalous, not heroes, not villains, sources. Where power came from, how it could be measured, replicated, weaponized, sold. She had scanned extremist soldiers and studied PIM particle compression and once spent 4 years trying unsuccessfully to isolate whatever it was that let Captain Marvel absorb a blast without dying. And in 30 years of that work she had never once encountered a subject that returned, on every instrument in her extremely well-funded arsenal, a flat and total 0. It again, she said. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Devlin who had learned the hard way that Dr. Sarkov's patience thinned in direct proportion to how interesting a subject became, ran it again. Same result. A man-shaped absence of data standing in a crater holding a demigod's fists like a pair of leashes. He's not suppressing a signature, Sarkov murmured mostly to herself, leaning closer to the screen. Suppression leaves residue. This is an absence of source, full stop. There's nothing to find because there's nothing there to power what he's doing. She turned to Devlin with the particular gleam in her eye that had, over the years, preceded several ethically questionable research proposals. Do you understand what that means if it's true, that he's not powered by anything? It means there's no ceiling, Sarkov said, and for the first time, something like real excitement crept into her clinical voice. Every powered being on this planet, everyone I've ever studied, has a limit built into its source. Gamma radiation degrades, serum saturates, cosmic energy has to come from somewhere and somewhere always runs dry eventually. But if there's no source, if what he does isn't powered by anything at all, if it's just what he is, then there's no reason to believe there's a limit to it. Ever, Devlin swallowed. That seems like it should worry us more than excite you. Worries me plenty, Sarkov said, already turning back to her monitors, already composing in her head the acquisition proposal she intended to have on 3 separate desks by morning. It also means whoever gets to him first gets to ask him to do something no one on this planet has ever been able to promise anybody, something with no upper bound. She was not, it turned out, the only one composing proposals that night. 400 miles above the Earth's surface, aboard a fortress ship that had drifted quietly through the outer edges of the solar system for the better part of a year. Largely unnoticed by a planet still recovering from its last brush with cosmic catastrophe, something ancient and violet-skinned sat in contemplative stillness, before a wall of screens relaying whispered reports gathered from a dozen different sources across the galaxy. Thanos had, in the years since his own reckoning, learned patience in a way few beings of his power ever bothered to. He watched the footage of the parking garage 3 times, expression unreadable, armored hands folded before him. "Source unknown," said the artificial voice cataloging the report for him, an old habit maintained more out of ceremony than necessity. "Power output sufficient to displace an Asgardian combatant a distance of 400 meters through reinforced structure, with no observable energy expenditure and no apparent fatigue." "No source," Thanos repeated quietly, and something in the words seemed to interest him more than any weapon report had in years. He had spent a lifetime, several lifetimes, by the reckoning of lesser beings, hunting the finite. Stones with edges, powers with prices. Balance always in the end required subtraction, and subtraction required something with a floor to be found. A being with no source implied a being with no floor. He did not move to act, not yet, but he filed the report the way a careful man files a debt he intends eventually to collect. It was not Thanos, however, nor Sarkov, nor any of the dozen quieter interests already circling New York like sharks scenting blood in still water, who moved first. It was a boy, barely older than Peter Parker, standing in an alley 2 blocks from the crater with a device clenched in one shaking hand. A device he had built himself out of scavenged tech and stolen schematics in a basement lab his mother didn't know existed, in the desperate, misguided conviction that if he could just prove himself powerful enough, someone somewhere would finally stop looking through him. His name was Milo Cade. The internet, in the hours since the crater had appeared, had already started calling the mysterious yellow-suited stranger who'd punched Thor the Cape Baldy, a nickname that had within 6 hours become the single most searched phrase in the tri-state area. And Milo, awkward, brilliant, invisible in every way that mattered to him, had watched every clip of it a dozen times, and had reached in the specific and dangerous way of the young and unseen, a conclusion nobody older would have made. If he could challenge the strongest thing to ever appear in this city, and win, or even just survive, everyone would finally have to look at him. He'd built the device from a partial Stark schematic he'd pulled off a leaked forum post, a kinetic amplifier meant, in its original design, purely for structural testing, jury-rigged now into something that promised on paper to multiply the wearer's physical output by a factor of 10. It had never been tested at full output. It had never been tested at all. Outside a simulation Milo had run twice and trusted considerably more than he should have. He found Saitama exactly where the internet had reported him last, sitting on the steps of the bodega, still working with quiet and genuine dedication, through what was now his 4th sandwich, while Peter argued cheerfully with him about whether ranch or hot sauce was the objectively correct condiment for the situation. "Hey," Milo said, voice cracking slightly on the word, device humming to life around his forearm in a nest of exposed wiring and stolen chips. "Hey Baldy, I need you to fight me." Peter's head came up first, sandwich forgotten, already halfway to his feet with the particular alarm of someone who recognized, immediately, a kid who'd made a very bad decision. "Whoa, hey buddy, that's not, you really don't want to do that, trust me, I've seen the highlight reel." "I'm not talking to you," Milo said, not unkindly, just single-mindedly, the tunnel vision of someone who had spent so long being invisible that he'd stopped being able to see anything else in the room. "I built this, it works, I tested the simulation. I just need one real fight to prove it, and I figured if I could last even a minute against the guy who beat Thor, that would mean something. That would finally mean something." Saitama set down his sandwich. He looked at the kid, really looked, the flat, unbothered mask of his face shifting into something quieter, something that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with recognition. The specific recognition of a man who had spent years being looked past, uncounted, unbelieved before anyone had ever taken his strength seriously either. "Kid," Saitama said gently, "turn that off." "I can't," Milo said, and something in his voice cracked wider now, less bravado, more desperation. "I need this to work, I need somebody to finally." The device, never tested past simulation, never meant to run at anything approaching the load Milo's shaking hands were now feeding into it, chose that exact moment to do what unstable homemade kinetic amplifiers built from stolen schematics in teenage basements generally do under real-world stress. It overloaded. not explosively, worse than that in its way. Containment failure, kinetic energy with nowhere designed to go, building in a feedback loop around Milo's own arm at a rate the boy's improvised safety cutoffs were never built to catch. Peter was already moving, webs firing, trying to yank the kid back, and even Bruce, 2 blocks away, felt something wrong in the air a half-second before it happened. That same low animal hum sharpening toward alarm. Saitama moved faster than either of them. He crossed the distance between the bodega steps and Milo in a blur too fast for the human eye, or the spider sense both, to fully register as motion rather than simple relocation. Closed one gloved hand around the failing device with the exact, precise, impossibly restrained pressure of a man who had spent years learning exactly how much force it took to crush something without hurting what was wrapped around it, and simply crushed it. The overload died in his palm with a sound like a held breath finally released. No explosion, no shockwave, just Milo shaking unharmed, staring down at the smoking remains of the only thing he'd ever built that he thought made him matter, now scattered across the pavement in pieces small enough to fit in Saitama's closed fist. "You could have died," Saitama said, still flat, still quiet. But there was something underneath it now, something that hadn't been there for Thor's warning shot or Hulk's opening swing, something that sounded, for the first time since he'd fallen through the sky, genuinely close to anger, or the nearest thing to it that a man this tired ever allowed himself. "I know," Milo said, voice small now, all the desperate bravado gone out of it. "I just wanted somebody to notice." Saitama crouched down until he was at eye level with the kid, which took some doing given the height difference, and for a long moment said nothing at all, just looked at him. The way you look at a smaller, younger version of a wound you recognize because you carried it yourself, a very long time ago in a universe that had also once refused to see him until he'd nearly destroyed something proving he was there. "I noticed," Saitama said finally. "You didn't need to nearly blow your arm off for that. Next time just say hi." It was by any measure a small moment, no lightning, no punch, no parking garage cratered by the force of it. But 3 miles up in the space between spaces where something ancient and faceless watched everything that happened in this city with the same cold, patient interest, that moment registered more clearly than either of the fights that had preceded it, because it told the watcher something the fights hadn't. It told the watcher that Saitama could be reached, not through threat. Not through force, God knew. Force had already failed twice today and would keep failing no matter how much of it was thrown at him. But through people. Through the small breakable things a being like that, endlessly displaced, endlessly alone across 100 universes, had apparently never quite learned to stop caring about, no matter how many worlds he passed through leaving them behind. The seam in the sky opened again that night, briefly, silently, over a location no sensor on Earth was tuned to notice. And on the other side of it, something without a name began with infinite and terrible patience to build its next move, not against Saitama directly, not yet, but against everyone standing close enough to him to matter. Because it had learned across the long, cold study of a great many universes, exactly what it took to make an unstoppable thing move exactly where you needed it to go. You didn't threaten the mountain. You threatened what the mountain had started, despite itself, to protect. The first sign that something had shifted came 4 days later, in the form of a distress signal that shouldn't have existed. It reached the Sanctum Sanctorum at 3:47 in the morning, routed through 6 different frequencies before it found one Strange's wards recognized. And by the time he'd pulled himself out of a meditation trance deep enough that Wang had to physically shake his shoulder to end it, the signal had already looped through its message 11 times. "It's Xanda," Wang said, grim. "What's left of it, automated relay, no live voice behind it. Says a Kree strike force has broken planetary defense and is converging on a coordinate that doesn't match any strategic target on the planet." "Then what's the target?" Wang pulled up the coordinate, cross-referenced it against 3 separate star charts, and went very still. "It's not on Xanda," he said slowly. "It's routing a fleet of Kree warships through a wormhole exit that terminates 6 blocks from where Saitama is currently sleeping." Strange was already reaching for his sling ring. They weren't in time to stop the wormhole from opening. Nobody could have been, not with 4 days' warning compressed into 11 minutes of relay static. But they were in time to watch it happen, standing on a rooftop 3 blocks from the crater that had, over the last 4 days, become something between a tourist attraction and a crime scene. As a tear in the sky, considerably larger and considerably less polite than the one that had first delivered Saitama, tore itself open above Midtown Manhattan and disgorged 4 Kree assault cruisers into a dead hover, engines screaming, weapons already hot. "That's not possible," Strange said, staring up at ships that belonged to a war half a galaxy away, a war that had, as far as anyone on Earth knew, ended years ago. "The Kree don't have wormhole tech that precise. Nobody does." Not without help. Somebody gave them a map, Tony said grimly, already suiting up, Repulsa's whining to life. And an invitation. Kree, it turned out, hadn't come looking for a fight with New York. They'd come looking for a fight with one man, and they'd been given, by a source none of them would ever manage to trace, exactly enough information to find him, his location, his patterns, and most usefully to a warrior culture that measured worth entirely in single combat. The rumor, delivered as if from a trusted informant, that he was the single strongest being to ever set foot on Terra, stronger than the Devastator that had once leveled half of Xanda. Stronger than anything the Kree Armada had faced since the death of Ronan. To the Kree, that wasn't a threat. That was an opportunity too glorious to pass up. Saitama woke up to the sound of a city block being disintegrated by plasma cannon fire, which, given the last few days, he'd come to recognize almost immediately as somebody else's problem that was about to become his problem, and was out of the borrowed apartment the Avengers had set him up in, small, spare, entirely unfurnished except for a bed, and at Peter's insistence, a truly excessive number of throw pillows. Before the second volley finished tearing through what remained of a parking structure 2 blocks over. He arrived on the street in time to watch the lead Kree commander, a 7-foot warrior in ceremonial battle armor named Von Cattle, step down from his flagship's landing ramp with the theatrical, unbothered confidence of a man who had never once lost a duel he'd formally challenged, and announce, in a voice amplified across 3 city blocks by tech considerably more advanced than anything Stark had reverse-engineered yet, that he had come to test himself against the strongest being on this world. And that any who interfered would be treated as combatants. "I don't even know you," Saitama said, standing in the middle of the street in pajama pants and a t-shirt, having not had time to grab the suit. "Can we do this tomorrow? I was asleep." Von Cattle did not appreciate this response. Von Cattle, in fact, opened with a plasma blast that leveled a Dwayne Reed. What followed lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and by any reasonable galactic standard, should have been the single largest media event in the recorded history of the Kree Empire. A full assault cruiser detachment, 4 ships, 40 elite warriors, and 1 commander whose duel record stretched back 3 decades, systematically and almost gently dismantled by a man in pajama pants who kept apologizing between blows for being short-tempered because he'd been woken up early. Von Cattle lasted longest, which was to say, he lasted the single punch it took to end things, delivered with the same restrained, controlled force Saitama had used on Thor, sending him skidding 200 feet down the street to crash, embarrassed but very much alive, into the side of a food truck that had, with remarkable bad luck, been serving falafel to a line of morning commuters until roughly 90 seconds earlier. The Avengers arrived in time to help with cleanup, not combat. Steve's shield still raised as he skidded to a stop beside the wreckage, taking in the scene of 4 disabled cruisers, 40 groaning Kree soldiers, and 1 deeply disgruntled commander being helped up out of a falafel truck by the very man who'd put him there. "You okay?" Saitama asked Von Cattle, offering him a hand. "You have humiliated the Kree Empire," Von Cattle said, with what dignity remained to a 7-foot warrior currently extracting hummus from his ceremonial breastplate. "Sorry," Saitama said, and sounded like he meant it. "You want breakfast? There's a diner around the corner. They do a good omelet." 3 miles up, watching through a seam so thin no sensor on the planet could have detected it, something ancient and patient noted with real satisfaction that the crack had widened again. Not visibly, nothing in that fight had torn reality the way the entity needed it to, not yet, but measurably, in the specific frequencies only it could read, the dimensional membrane around this particular pocket of spacetime growing thinner with every display of force this universe's strongest defenses threw at Saitama and lost. It was patient. It had been patient across the ruin of 11 previous universes, each one selected, tested, and discarded before it, and it understood with the cold clarity of something that had stopped counting years centuries ago, that the crack would not open all at once. It would open one confrontation at a time, one desperate escalation after another, each fight a little larger than the last, each victory adding its small and terrible weight to a membrane that could not hold forever. The Kree had been a message. The next visitor would be a demonstration. Captain Marvel arrived 6 hours later, and unlike the Kree, she did not arrive angry or confused or looking for a fight. She arrived because Nick Fury's emergency pager had gone off with a message she'd never once, in years of carrying it, seen triggered before. A threat assessment that read, in its entirety, potential extinction level anomaly. Request immediate consult. She found Saitama sitting on the steps of the same bodega, sharing lunch with Peter, and now, still slightly humiliated but considerably more relaxed Vorn cattle, who had apparently decided that a man who'd beat him in 4 minutes and then bought him a Denver omelet was, at minimum, worth staying to talk to. The one who put 4 Kree cruisers down without firing a shot, Carol said. It wasn't a question. I threw a punch, Saitama said. One, does that count as a shot? It counts as the single largest unarmed combat data point Fury's ever flagged me for, Carol said, studying him with the careful, professional assessment of someone who had, over years of service, learned to read power the way other people read faces. She'd fought Thanos. She'd absorbed the raw output of an infinity stone and walked away standing. She had, by any reasonable measure available to her, never once met her equal. Something about the readout Friday had sent her, the flat, sourceless nothing where a power signature should have been, unsettled her more than any villain profile she'd ever reviewed. Not here to fight you, she said. I want to be clear about that up front. Good, Saitama said. I've had enough fights this week. Want a sandwich? Peter knows a good place. I do know a good place, Peter confirmed, mouth full. Carol almost smiled, because underneath the strange, disarming ordinariness of the invitation, she could feel something wrong in the air, the same low hum Bruce had described feeling the day Saitama arrived. A pressure behind the eyes that had nothing to do with him directly and everything to do with something watching from just outside the edges of what any of them could perceive. She would have taken him up on the sandwich too, if the sky hadn't torn open again 40 seconds later. Not gently this time, not the clean, considered seam that had delivered Saitama, but a violent, jagged rupture that split the afternoon sky like a wound spilling storm-dark light down onto 43rd Street as something vast and armored and entirely, catastrophically familiar stepped through into a city that had, until that exact moment, believed its worst chapter with that particular name had already been written and closed. Thanos did not announce himself. He did not monologue. He stepped through the tier with the Infinity Gauntlet's replacement, a lesser but still devastating device his people had spent years rebuilding from salvaged Chitauri tech, capable of channeling raw power without the stone's full cosmic weight, already humming to life on his wrist, and fixed his gaze on the small, unassuming man sitting on a bodega's front steps with a sandwich in one hand. I am told, Thanos said in a voice that had once, not so long ago, made half a universe hold its breath, that you have no source, no limit, no finite thing I can take from you to make you understand balance. He raised the gauntlet, violet light gathering across its knuckles in a slow, terrible bloom. I intend to test that claim personally. Carol was airborne before the sentence finished, Peter already web-slinging himself between Saitama and the blast radius out of pure reflex, and for one heart-stopping second the entire block held its breath, waiting for the kind of violence that had, the last time this particular being visited Earth, ended in half of all life turning to ash. Saitama set down his sandwich. I know you, he said, standing, and something in his flat, unbothered voice had gone very quiet, very still. Not fear, nothing close to fear, but the particular focused attention of a man who had, somewhere in 100 forgotten universes, met versions of exactly this kind of certainty before and had learned exactly what it cost the people standing near it. You're the guy who thinks killing half of everything is balance. I am the one who understands sacrifice, Thanos said. Something your kind never learns until it's too late. Made a lot of sacrifices, Saitama said. Every world I go to I save it and then I leave because something bigger always shows up somewhere else. I don't get thanked, I don't get to stay, I don't even usually get remembered. He stepped forward off the bodega steps, past Peter's webbing, past Carol's raised hand telling him to wait. You don't know the first thing about balance, you just liked having an excuse. Gauntlet fired. It was, by every measure, available to Carol Danvers, who had personally absorbed a comparable blast and nearly not survived the experience, a devastating release of raw, condensed cosmic force, a beam capable of unmaking a moon aimed dead center at a man in pajama pants who had 4 hours earlier apologized to a Kree commander for being short-tempered. Saitama caught it with one hand. The beam did not stop cleanly, the way Thor's punch had stopped, the way Hulk's fists had stopped. It fought him, violet light wrapping around his forearm, straining, screaming against his palm with a pressure that cratered the street beneath his boots 6 feet deep in a widening ring, that shattered every window on the block for the second time in a week, that sent Peter and Carol both stumbling backward from the sheer displaced force of it, and Saitama simply stood there, arm extended, absorbing a blast that should have, by every law of physics either universe had ever agreed on, erased him from existence. And then, with the same flat, unhurried motion he'd used to catch a punch 4 days earlier, he closed his fist around it and crushed the beam out of existence between his fingers like he was closing a hand around a firefly. The silence that followed was total. Thanos stared at his own gauntlet, at the dead, smoking husk of a device that had, moments before, held enough power to threaten a planet. And for the first time in longer than history bothered to record, something that might, in a lesser being, have been called doubt crossed his ancient, scarred face. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "You said that already," Saitama said, unbothered, though there was a tightness now around his eyes that hadn't been there before, the particular strain of a man who had absorbed considerably more force than he wanted anyone to notice he'd absorbed. "Everybody says that, I don't know why, it happens a lot." Thanos did not attack again. He stood very still, studying the small man across the ruined street with an expression that, translated from a face built for war and conquest and terrible certainty, read unmistakably as recalculation. The look of a being who had, for the first time in his long and violent life, encountered a variable his philosophy had no framework to account for. "Someone sent me here," he said finally. "A voice, no face, no name. It told me you were the last piece of the puzzle it needed. It offered me a chance to test my strength against something worthy one final time." He lowered the ruined gauntlet slowly. "I begin to understand now that I was not sent here to defeat you." "Then why?" Carol demanded, landing beside Saitama, fists still raised, unwilling to fully stand down even now. "Because whatever sent me doesn't want him beaten," Thanos said, looking past her directly at Saitama with something that was not quite respect and not quite warning. "It wants him tested, again and again, until something in this world can no longer hold the weight of what he is." He stepped back toward the tear he'd come through, which had not closed and which pulsed now with a faint, patient light. "I have made war my whole existence, and I know a trap when I have walked willingly into one. You should ask yourselves what happens when he finally stops being able to hold back." Tears swallowed him whole, and closed behind him with the same clean, deliberate precision that had delivered Saitama 4 days earlier. The signature Strange would confirm within the hour, arriving breathless from the sanctum with 3 new scans already running, of the exact same unseen hand. Saitama stood in the middle of the crater Thanos' blast had carved into 43rd Street, breathing harder than any of them had seen him breathe yet, staring down at his own scorched glove with an expression that had, for the first time since he'd fallen out of the sky, tipped over from unbothered into something that looked unmistakably like fear. Not of Thanos, not of the Kree, not of anything that had hit him. Fear of what Thanos had said on his way out. "He's right," Saitama said quietly, mostly to himself, as Peter and Carol and moments later Strange himself gathered around him in the wreckage of a street that had now been destroyed twice in 1 week because of him. "I felt it, that last hit. I had to actually push back, actually catch it, not just stand there." He looked up and the flatness in his voice had cracked into something raw underneath. "That's never happened before, not since, not in a long time." Strange knelt beside the crater's edge, running a scan that had nothing to do with Saitama and everything to do with the air itself, and the numbers that came back made even his composed, careful face go pale. "Membranes thinning," he said quietly to no one and everyone. "Every fight, every escalation, it's not testing him for its own sake, it's using him like a hammer, and every strike is cracking something none of us can see." He looked up at Saitama, and for the first time real dread had crept into his voice. "If this keeps escalating, if whatever's doing this keeps sending bigger threats and you keep winning, I don't think the damage is going to stop at broken windows." "Then what happens?" Peter asked, quiet now too, all the easy banter gone out of his voice. Strange didn't answer right away. He looked past all of them up at a sky that looked, to every untrained eye on that street, perfectly ordinary, blue, clouded, indifferent, and saw, in the specific and terrible way only a Sorcerer Supreme could see, the fine, spreading cracks already beginning to show through. "I think," he said finally, "we're being softened up for something none of us are going to walk away from by accident." Dr. Strange spent the next 2 days barely sleeping, cycling through every divination technique the Sanctum's library contained, chasing a signature that kept slipping away from him the moment he got close, like trying to read a word written in smoke. By the 3rd night, he had a name for the shape of the thing, even if he didn't yet have a name for the thing itself. "It's not a being that lives in a place," he told the assembled team, gathered now in a war room that had, over the course of one very strange week, become considerably more crowded than usual. Tony, Steve, Natasha, Bruce, Carol, Peter perched on a counter because nobody had told him not to. and Saitama sitting very still in a chair too small for the weight of what he now understood he was carrying. It's not from a dimension the way Thanos is from Titan, or the Kree are from Hala. It exists in the seams, in the thin places between universes where the walls run weakest. I think it's been doing this for a very long time, testing worlds, testing champions, looking for exactly the kind of variable it thinks it's finally found. What variable is that? Steve asked. Something with no measurable limit, Strange said, looking at Saitama not unkindly but without softening it either. Every threat this planet has ever produced, every cosmic force, every god, every stone, they all have an edge somewhere. A place where the power runs out or the source burns dry or the body simply can't hold anymore. That's not a flaw, that's a mercy. It's what keeps reality's math from breaking. He paused. You don't have that edge, as far as I can find, you never have. And something out there has spent who knows how many universes trying to find exactly that, because it's realized something the rest of us haven't. Which is, Tony asked. That reality has rules the way a bridge has a weight limit, Strange said. You can drive heavier and heavier trucks across it and it holds and it holds, and it holds right up until the one truck that finally doesn't fit under the limit anymore, and then it doesn't matter how good the bridge was built. It just isn't built to hold that. He looked at Saitama again. I think that's what you are to it. The one truck, no version of reality was built to survive completely unleashed. Saitama had said very little through most of this. He sat with his hands loosely folded, staring at a point on the floor, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual flatness, just a tired, quiet honesty that made even Tony go still. Felt this before, he said. Not exactly this, but close. Every universe I land in, there's always something bigger waiting at the end. Something that wants me to get stronger, wants me to push harder, and every time I do, something breaks a little more than it should have. He looked up. I always thought that was just how it worked. Fight the biggest thing, win, move on. I never once stopped to ask why there was always something bigger. Because it was you, Strange said, quiet now too, all along. Every universe you've passed through, I bet everything I have that this same thing has been following you across all of them, feeding you bigger fights, watching the cracks get worse and discarding each universe once it broke past whatever it was measuring for. You're not the guest star in this story, you're the experiment. It's been running the same test on you for who knows how many worlds, and this is just the latest lab. Room went very quiet. So how do we stop it? Peter asked into the silence. That, Strange said, is the part I haven't solved yet because it doesn't want to fight him. He looked at Saitama. It wants him to fight. It's been building toward one specific moment this whole time, one hit big enough, one victory decisive enough that when it finally lands, the membrane doesn't just crack, it tears. And once that happens, I don't think it stays contained to one universe. I think it takes this one down with it and possibly whatever's next in line. The plan is what? Tony said. We just never let him fight again because that seems like a plan with a pretty short shelf life given the last week. The plan, Strange said, is that we figure out how to beat it without giving it what it wants. Which means the one thing none of us can do is throw more force at this problem. Force is the bait. Force is what it's been engineering this whole time. That night, the seam opened for the final time, not quietly, not carefully, but with the violent, tearing finality of something that no longer needed to be careful, because it had at last decided it had gathered enough. It came down over Central Park at midnight, and unlike every arrival before it, it did not bring a champion or an army or a weapon. It came alone, unfolding itself out of the tier like something that had been holding a shape only out of politeness, and had finally stopped bothering, vast and formless and made of the same dark, cracked light. Strange had been chasing through his divinations for 3 days, a presence that pressed down on every mind within a mile radius like the moment before a held breath finally breaks. There were no words at first. Just the pressure of it, and the slow, spreading frost of understanding that crept over everyone standing in the park. Saitama, Strange, Tony in a suit already redlining every sensor it had, Carol hovering with fists clenched, Peter web-slinging in low with his heart in his throat, even Thor, who had insisted over Steve's objections on being there for whatever came next. You have been a remarkable specimen, the thing said, and the voice did not come from any single point in the dark, formless mass. It came from everywhere at once, from the ground and the sky and the space directly behind every skull in the park, a violation of ordinary hearing that made even Thor wince. Across 11 WRLDS, you have always disappointed in me by surviving without ever truly unleashing what you are. This world has finally given me what the others could not, a reason worth your full strength. I don't know you, Saitama said, standing very still, every muscle in his body coiled with an old, familiar readiness that Strange, watching closely, recognized with a spike of alarm as exactly the readiness the entity wanted to see. But I'm getting real tired of things that think they know what I am better than I do. I know exactly what you are, the entity said. I have studied you across 11 collapsed realities. You are the one variable that every universe's physics fails to contain. And tonight, I intend to finally find out what happens when that variable stops holding back. Something in the dark mass shifted, and for the first time, a shape resolved out of it, vaguely humanoid, vaguely ancient, wearing across what might have been a face and expression that was not quite a smile and not quite hunger, but shared the worst qualities of both. I have prepared this world for you, WAKNED the SEAMS. Thin the walls, all that remains is one strike from you DELIVRED in true, unguarded anger, and this reality will come apart at every edge I have already worn thin. And then at last I will know. Know what? Carol demanded, voice tight. Whether there is anything in all of creation that actually has a limit, the entity said, or whether everything, given enough pressure, eventually breaks. It attacked without further ceremony, not at Saitama, not directly, but outward, in a single vast pulse that swept across the park and the 6 blocks beyond it, shattering trees, cratering the reservoir, sending Thor and Carol both slamming backward through the air and knocking Tony's suit briefly offline mid-flight. It was not, Strange realized instantly, an attack meant to hurt Saitama at all. It was an attack meant to hurt everyone standing near him. It would be faster if you simply struck back, the entity said, as Peter scrambled to catch a falling chunk of masonry before it landed on a park bench, as Steve threw himself bodily in front of a civilian jogger who'd frozen in terror at the edge of the destruction. But I have learned patience across 11 WORLDS. I can afford to break everything you have come to care about in this one, piece by piece, until you finally stop holding back out of spite. Saitama's hands curled into fists. Strange saw it happen the exact moment the old, patient flatness in the man's face began to crack, replaced by something hot and furious, and for the first time since he'd arrived, genuinely dangerous. This was, Strange understood with a cold lurch of dread, exactly the moment the entity had spent 11 universes engineering. Not a fight, a provocation aimed with surgical precision at the one thing this endlessly displaced, endlessly alone man had never learned to fully protect. The people he'd only just started, cautiously, hopefully, to let himself care about. Saitama, don't, Strange shouted, already moving, cloak snapping out behind him as he cut through the chaos toward him. Whatever you do, don't punch it. Saitama turned to him, fists still clenched, breathing hard, every instinct in his body screaming at him to end this the way he'd ended everything else across 11 forgotten worlds, one clean, decisive, overwhelming blow. Then what am I supposed to do? He demanded, and there was real desperation under the anger now, the particular helplessness of a man who had never once in his entire existence been asked to solve a problem that a fist couldn't fix. It's hurting people. It's not going to stop unless I make it stop. Think, Strange said, gripping his shoulder, forcing him to hold still for one critical second amid the falling masonry and screaming civilians and the vast, patient hunger of the thing bearing down on all of them. It's not vulnerable to force. It's built this whole trap around force. Every fight you've won across every universe you've passed through has fed it exactly what it wanted. If you hit it now, really hit it the way it wants you to, you don't win. You finish its experiment. You tear this reality open exactly the way it spent this whole week engineering you to. So what, I just stand here? Saitama's voice cracked, raw with a frustration that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with a lifetime of having exactly one tool and being told for the first time that the tool was the trap. No, Strange said. You use the one thing it never once accounted for in 11 universes of research, because it spent this whole time studying what you can destroy, and it never once bothered to study what you actually want. He looked past Saitama, toward the vast dark shape reforming after its last pulse, gathering itself for what would clearly be a far larger strike. It thinks you're a weapon with no ceiling. It's never once considered that you might just be a person who's tired of being used as one. Saitama went very still. Something in his face changed, the fury draining out of it replaced not by the old flatness, not by the tired resignation he'd worn like armor since the day he'd fallen out of the sky, but by something quieter and considerably harder to engineer around. Clarity. He unclenched his fists. You hesitate, the entity said, and for the first time, something like uncertainty crept into that vast, omnipresent voice. Across 11 WORLDS, you have never HESITATD when those you care for were THRETNED. Strike, finish it, prove at last that something in creation has no limit. You spent 11 universes trying to figure out if I have a ceiling, Saitama said, and his voice had gone flat again, but not the old flatness, not the exhausted, unbothered deadpan of a man too tired to feel anything. This was a colder, steadier flatness, the flatness of a decision already made. You never once asked what happens if I just don't. He turned to Strange. You said it needs a real hit, one I actually mean with everything behind it. Yes, then it doesn't get one. Saitama looked back at the vast dark shape, at 11 universes worth of patient, hungry calculation staring down at him through a hole in the world, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled small, tired, and entirely without malice. You built this whole trap assuming I only know how to solve problems one way. That's kind of insulting, actually. I've been doing this a long time. I know how to lose on purpose too. Are you? Saitama didn't finish the sentence for it. He simply let his knees buckle, dropped flat onto the cratered grass of Central Park, and did not get back up. It should have been absurd. It nearly was. Overhead, the entity's vast form roiled with confusion, its next pulse gathering and then faltering, unable to find purchase on a target that had simply deliberately refused to fight back, because the entire architecture of its trap, Strange realized with a rush of vindicated understanding, had been built entirely around provoking a strike, and had never once accounted for the possibility that the one variable it had spent 11 universes studying might simply choose. In the one moment that mattered most to lose, this is not, the entity said, its voice fracturing now, the vast dark shape flickering at its edges like a signal losing its transmission. You cannot simply refuse. The pattern requires me to fight, Saitama said, from flat on his back in the grass, looking up at 11 universes worth of accumulated hunger with an expression of profound, weary calm. I'm not fighting. I'm just a guy lying in a park. You spent this whole time building a trap for a fighter. I stopped being that for right now on purpose. What are you gonna do about a guy who just won't get up? It was, in the strictest sense, an act of enormous and unglamorous defiance. No lightning, no punch, no shockwave leveling a parking garage. Just a man lying still, refusing the one script that 11 ruined universes had trained him, however unknowingly, to follow every single time. And it worked because the entity, for all its patience, for all its cold and careful engineering, had built its entire existence around the certainty that power, given enough provocation, always eventually swung. It had never planned for a target that simply set the provocation down. The dark mass began to come apart, not violently, not all at once, but in the slow, grinding way of a machine that has run out of the one input it needed to function, its vast form thinning at the edges, the pressure in the air lifting block by block as the seams it had spent a week deliberately weakening began, without a decisive strike to tear them open, to simply knit themselves quietly back shut. 11 WRLDS, it said, voice fading now, less a roar and more a confused, dwindling echo. 11 WRLDS, and you finally break the pattern by doing nothing, Saitama said, sitting up now, watching it unravel with something that looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, almost like relief. Yeah, turns out that was always an option. Nobody ever told me. The last of the dark mass folded in on itself and vanished, the seam it had torn in the sky above Central Park closing with a soft, final sound, less an explosion and more the sound of a held breath finally let go. And then, for the first time in a week, the sky over Manhattan was simply, ordinarily empty. Strange lowered his hand slowly, the defensive spell he'd been holding ready dissolving unused, and stared at the space where the entity had been with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and genuine, disbelieving awe. You beat a being that's unraveled 11 universes, he said slowly, by taking a nap. I didn't take a nap, Saitama said, lying back down in the grass, arms behind his head, staring up at a sky that was, for the moment, entirely blessedly ordinary. I just stopped being what it needed me to be. He closed his eyes. Honestly, kind of the first real win I've had in a long time that didn't leave a crater. Around them, slowly, the others regrouped, Peter dropping down beside him with a whoop of relief that dissolved almost immediately into a tight, grateful hug Saitama accepted without complaint. Carol landing nearby, lowering her fists at last. Thor limping over with a grudging, respectful nod that said more than any words the god of thunder could have managed. Tony's suit retracting halfway as he crouched down beside the crater's edge, staring at the man who had just apparently outthought something that had eaten 11 realities by refusing to throw a single punch. So, Tony said finally, for the record, that's not a strategy that scales right. We can't just tell the next cosmic threat to take a nap. Probably not, Saitama admitted, eyes still closed, sounding, for the first time in this entire universe, genuinely, thoroughly at peace. But it worked this time, and honestly, I think that might be the first time in a long time somebody actually taught me something instead of the other way around. glanced sideways at Strange, who was still standing there, cloak settling slowly around his shoulders, looking down at the man who had just solved, through sheer stubborn refusal, a problem no amount of force in this universe or any other could have touched. "Thanks," Saitama said, "for the advice." "Thank me yet?" Strange said, managing something close to a tired smile. "We still have to explain to the mayor's office why there's a 200-foot crater in Central Park." The crater in Central Park took the city 11 days to fill and repave, and in that time, something quieter and considerably more permanent had already begun filling in around the man who'd caused it. It started small. Peter showed up at the borrowed apartment with a second lamp. Because he insisted, one lamp and a suspicious number of throw pillows did not constitute a living room. It constituted a hostage situation with better lighting, and stayed to help assemble a bookshelf neither of them actually needed. Mostly because assembling furniture together turned out to be an easier way for two people who'd nearly died together to sit in the same room without talking about it directly. Bruce started leaving him actual groceries instead of just coffee, on the theory, never stated out loud, that a man who'd spent a week eating exclusively bodega sandwiches deserved better, and one Tuesday evening simply stayed for dinner, the two of them eating in comfortable silence in a kitchen that had, a week earlier, held nothing but a single mug. Carol came by twice, ostensibly for debriefs that ran 20 minutes and somehow turned into 2-hour conversations about what it was like to be the strongest person in a room and still feel, most days, entirely alone in it. A conversation neither of them had ever had with anyone else, because neither of them had ever met anyone else who understood the particular, specific loneliness of being unbeatable. Even Thor stopped by once unannounced, carrying 2 flagons of something that smelled distinctly like it wasn't legal in this realm, and simply sat on the apartment's single, battered couch with Saitama for the better part of an evening, saying very little because, as Thor put it somewhere around the second flagon, there is a particular kind of company that requires no words between beings who have both, at some point, punched a friend by accident and had to live with it. Saitama did not, as it turned out, take the government job, the research fellowship, or the collector's considerably improved second offer, which arrived by discreet courier 3 days after the Central Park incident and was, this time, politely and immediately declined without even being opened. He did, however, agree, after a full week of Steve Rogers' careful, patient, entirely unpushy persistence, to a considerably smaller arrangement. A standing invitation, no contract, no oversight committee, no paperwork beyond a single laminated card that got him past the front desk security at the Avengers compound, extended for exactly one reason, which Steve stated plainly over coffee on a quiet Thursday morning. "We're not asking you to be an Avenger," Steve said. "We tried that with people who didn't want it and it never went well for anybody. We're asking if, when something shows up that's bigger than what we can handle, and given the last 2 weeks, I think we both know that's going to happen again, you'd be willing to pick up the phone." "I don't have a phone," Saitama said. "We'll get you a phone." Saitama considered this for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands and something in his face. The old, tired flatness that had, for 100 forgotten universes, meant nothing but another arrival, another fight, another quiet departure before anyone learned his name properly, softened into something that looked, for the first time in longer than he could remember, almost like belonging. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, I'll pick up the phone." It was not, by the standards of the world he'd fallen into 2 weeks earlier, a dramatic resolution. There was no parade, no medal, no formal ceremony. Tony had suggested one, briefly, before Saitama's flat, immediate no ended the conversation with the same finality he'd once used to end a fight with Thanos. There was, instead, something smaller and considerably more valuable. Standing table at the corner diner near 43rd Street, where the owner, having personally witnessed both the Kree incident and its aftermath, had taken to comping the omelets on principle, and where on a quiet Sunday morning 2 weeks after the sky had first torn open above him, Saitama found himself surrounded, not by threats, not by factions jockeying for position, not by anyone trying to classify or contain or acquire him, but simply by people who had, somewhere in the chaos, decided he was worth having around. Peter slid into the booth first, already talking, already 3 sentences into a story about a physics test he'd nearly slept through. Bruce followed, quieter, setting down a newspaper he wasn't really going to read. Carol arrived last, dropping into the booth with the easy, unbothered confidence of someone who'd finally, after years of searching for an equal, found one who didn't need to prove it. "You know," Bruce said halfway through his own coffee, For a guy who spent a week nearly ending the world twice, you've settled in pretty fast. Had practice, Saitama said, and there was no weight in it now, none of the old exhaustion, just a simple, flat statement of fact from a man who had, for the first time in longer than he could count, stopped counting the days until the next portal opened. This is the first place that offered breakfast before asking me to save anything. It time, Carol said, dry but not unkind. Yeah, Saitama agreed and smiled, small, real, entirely without performance. I figured. 3 miles up, and considerably further than that in every direction that mattered, the seam that had once connected this universe to the cold, patient hunger of something that had unraveled 11 realities before it finally, at long last, closed for good, not with the violent finality of a battle won, but with the quiet, unglamorous permanence of a door someone had simply decided, after a very long time, not to walk through anymore. Doctor Strange felt it happen 3 days after the diner breakfast, a subtle loosening in the fabric of things he'd been monitoring obsessively since Central Park, and allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, a full night's sleep. It did not mean the multiverse had gone quiet. Somewhere on a world Strange would not learn about for months, a hairline crack no larger than the one that had once opened above a bodega on 43rd Street had already begun patiently to widen, because 11 broken universes had taught the thing that made these tears exactly one lesson worth remembering, and it was not a lesson about defeat. It was a lesson about persistence, but that was for now someone else's mourning, some other city's crater, some other Strange's problem to solve. In this one, the sky stayed blue, the diner kept comping omelets, and a man who had spent longer than he could remember arriving and leaving, sat in a booth on a Sunday morning, surrounded by people who had chosen, deliberately and without being asked to keep him around. For the first time across every universe he had ever fallen into, Saitama did not check the sky for cracks. He just finished his coffee. There is a particular kind of story New York tells itself after every disaster, a story about heroes, about power, about the line between what can be stopped and what simply has to be survived. This one started that way too. A man falling out of the sky, a crater on 43rd Street, a series of escalating, city-shaking confrontations that should have, by every rule this universe understood about power, ended in exactly the kind of catastrophe it had barely escaped before. But the story that actually unfolded was never really about how hard Saitama could hit. Every universe he'd ever passed through had already answered that question over and over, until the answer itself had become the trap. A pattern so reliable that something ancient and patient had learned to weaponize it across 11 collapsed realities, using his own unbeaten record as the very leash it used to walk him toward disaster. What made this universe different wasn't a bigger threat, or a clever strategy, or a more powerful ally standing beside him when the fight came. It was, in the end, something almost embarrassingly small. A kid who offered him a sandwich before asking him to save anyone. A scientist who noticed he'd stopped sleeping and left him groceries instead of a lecture. A god who sat with him in silence because some things don't need words. A team that offered him a phone number instead of a contract. Somewhere in the space between 100 forgotten arrivals and 100 quiet departures, Saitama had learned exactly one way to solve a problem. Hit it until it stopped being a problem. What this universe finally gave him, what none of the previous 11 had thought or bothered or lasted long enough to offer, was the one thing that had never once been part of the equation. Something worth losing on purpose to protect. Something that made refusing to fight feel, for the first time, like the stronger choice. The Marvel Universe was not, in any way that mattered, changed by how hard Saitama could hit. It was changed by the fact that, for one crucial moment, standing in a crater in Central Park with a being that had already unraveled 11 realities pressing down on everything he'd started cautiously to care about, he chose not to. It cost him nothing, and it cost him everything, the same restraint that had once been a burden, an isolating, lonely habit built from 100 worlds that never gave him a reason to do anything but win and leave, finally, quietly becoming something he chose on purpose, for people who were worth the choosing. The Avengers gained an ally they never had to recruit. Peter Parker gained the strangest, most unshakable friendship of his young life. And somewhere in a small apartment 2 blocks from a filled-in crater, a man who had wandered 11 universes without ever once being asked to stay finally for the first time was whether the entity's failure here means it's finished, or whether some other universe, some other Saitama, some other version of a man too strong to need saving and too tired to know he needed staying, is even now falling through a different sky toward a different, colder reception, remains an open question. The seams between worlds are thin, and patient things have a way of trying again. But for now in this universe on this Sunday morning, the coffee is warm, the omelets are free, and for the first time in longer than he can remember, Saitama isn't watching the sky for cracks. With great power comes great responsibility, and sometimes the greatest power of all is knowing when not to use it. More stories await. The crater in Central Park took the city 11 days to fill and repave, and in that time, something quieter and considerably more permanent had already begun filling in around the man who'd caused it. It started small. Peter showed up at the borrowed apartment with a second lamp. Because he insisted, one lamp and a suspicious number of throw pillows did not constitute a living room. It constituted a hostage situation with better lighting, and stayed to help assemble a bookshelf neither of them actually needed, mostly because assembling furniture together turned out to be an easier way for two people who'd nearly died together to sit in the same room without talking about it directly. Bruce started leaving him actual groceries instead of just coffee, on the theory, never stated out loud, that a man who'd spent a week eating exclusively bodega sandwiches deserved better, and one Tuesday evening simply stayed for dinner, the two of them eating in comfortable silence in a kitchen that had, a week earlier, held nothing but a single mug. Carol came by twice, ostensibly for debriefs that ran 20 minutes and somehow turned into 2-hour conversations about what it was like to be the strongest person in a room and still feel, most days, entirely alone in it. A conversation neither of them had ever had with anyone else, because neither of them had ever met anyone else who understood the particular, specific loneliness of being unbeatable. Even Thor stopped by once unannounced, carrying 2 flagons of something that smelled distinctly like it wasn't legal in this realm, and simply sat on the apartment's single, battered couch with Saitama for the better part of an evening, saying very little because, as Thor put it somewhere around the second flagon, there is a particular kind of company that requires no words between beings who have both, at some point, punched a friend by accident and had to live with it. Saitama did not, as it turned out, take the government job, the research fellowship, or the collector's considerably improved second offer, which arrived by discreet courier 3 days after the Central Park incident and was, this time, politely and immediately declined without even being opened. He did, however, agree, after a full week of Steve Rogers' careful, patient, entirely unpushy persistence, to a considerably smaller arrangement. A standing invitation, no contract, no oversight committee, no paperwork beyond a single laminated card that got him past the front desk security at the Avengers compound, extended for exactly one reason, which Steve stated plainly over coffee on a quiet Thursday morning. "We're not asking you to be an Avenger," Steve said. "We tried that with people who didn't want it and it never went well for anybody. We're asking if, when something shows up that's bigger than what we can handle, and given the last 2 weeks, I think we both know that's going to happen again, you'd be willing to pick up the phone." "I don't have a phone," Saitama said. "We'll get you a phone." Saitama considered this for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands and something in his face. The old, tired flatness that had, for 100 forgotten universes, meant nothing but another arrival, another fight, another quiet departure before anyone learned his name properly, softened into something that looked, for the first time in longer than he could remember, almost like belonging. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, I'll pick up the phone." It was not, by the standards of the world he'd fallen into 2 weeks earlier, a dramatic resolution. There was no parade, no medal, no formal ceremony. Tony had suggested one, briefly, before Saitama's flat, immediate no ended the conversation with the same finality he'd once used to end a fight with Thanos. There was, instead, something smaller and considerably more valuable. Standing table at the corner diner near 43rd Street, where the owner, having personally witnessed both the Kree incident and its aftermath, had taken to comping the omelets on principle, and where on a quiet Sunday morning 2 weeks after the sky had first torn open above him, Saitama found himself surrounded, not by threats, not by factions jockeying for position, not by anyone trying to classify or contain or acquire him, but simply by people who had, somewhere in the chaos, decided he was worth having around. Peter slid into the booth first, already talking, already 3 sentences into a story about a physics test he'd nearly slept through. Bruce followed, quieter, setting down a newspaper he wasn't really going to read. Carol arrived last, dropping into the booth with the easy, unbothered confidence of someone who'd finally, after years of searching for an equal, found one who didn't need to prove it. "You know," Bruce said halfway through his own coffee, "for a guy who spent a week nearly ending the world twice, you've settled in pretty fast. Had practice, Saitama said, and there was no weight in it now, none of the old exhaustion, just a simple, flat statement of fact from a man who had, for the first time in longer than he could count, stopped counting the days until the next portal opened. This is the first place that offered breakfast before asking me to save anything. It time, Carol said, dry but not unkind. Yeah, Saitama agreed and smiled, small, real, entirely without performance. I figured. 3 miles up, and considerably further than that in every direction that mattered, the seam that had once connected this universe to the cold, patient hunger of something that had unraveled 11 realities before it finally, at long last, closed for good, not with the violent finality of a battle won, but with the quiet, unglamorous permanence of a door someone had simply decided, after a very long time, not to walk through anymore. Doctor Strange felt it happen 3 days after the diner breakfast, a subtle loosening in the fabric of things he'd been monitoring obsessively since Central Park, and allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, a full night's sleep. It did not mean the multiverse had gone quiet. Somewhere on a world Strange would not learn about for months, a hairline crack no larger than the one that had once opened above a bodega on 43rd Street had already begun patiently to widen, because 11 broken universes had taught the thing that made these tears exactly one lesson worth remembering, and it was not a lesson about defeat. It was a lesson about persistence, but that was for now someone else's mourning, some other city's crater, some other Strange's problem to solve. In this one, the sky stayed blue, the diner kept comping omelets, and a man who had spent longer than he could remember arriving and leaving, sat in a booth on a Sunday morning, surrounded by people who had chosen, deliberately and without being asked to keep him around. For the first time across every universe he had ever fallen into, Saitama did not check the sky for cracks. He just finished his coffee. There is a particular kind of story New York tells itself after every disaster, a story about heroes, about power, about the line between what can be stopped and what simply has to be survived. This one started that way too. A man falling out of the sky, a crater on 43rd Street, a series of escalating, city-shaking confrontations that should have, by every rule this universe understood about power, ended in exactly the kind of catastrophe it had barely escaped before. But the story that actually unfolded was never really about how hard Saitama could hit. Every universe he'd ever passed through had already answered that question over and over, until the answer itself had become the trap. A pattern so reliable that something ancient and patient had learned to weaponize it across 11 collapsed realities, using his own unbeaten record as the very leash it used to walk him toward disaster. What made this universe different wasn't a bigger threat, or a clever strategy, or a more powerful ally standing beside him when the fight came. It was, in the end, something almost embarrassingly small. A kid who offered him a sandwich before asking him to save anyone. A scientist who noticed he'd stopped sleeping and left him groceries instead of a lecture. A god who sat with him in silence because some things don't need words. A team that offered him a phone number instead of a contract. Somewhere in the space between 100 forgotten arrivals and 100 quiet departures, Saitama had learned exactly one way to solve a problem. Hit it until it stopped being a problem. What this universe finally gave him, what none of the previous 11 had thought or bothered or lasted long enough to offer, was the one thing that had never once been part of the equation. Something worth losing on purpose to protect. Something that made refusing to fight feel, for the first time, like the stronger choice. The Marvel Universe was not, in any way that mattered, changed by how hard Saitama could hit. It was changed by the fact that, for one crucial moment, standing in a crater in Central Park with a being that had already unraveled 11 realities pressing down on everything he'd started cautiously to care about, he chose not to. It cost him nothing, and it cost him everything, the same restraint that had once been a burden, an isolating, lonely habit built from 100 worlds that never gave him a reason to do anything but win and leave, finally, quietly becoming something he chose on purpose, for people who were worth the choosing. The Avengers gained an ally they never had to recruit. Peter Parker gained the strangest, most unshakable friendship of his young life. And somewhere in a small apartment 2 blocks from a filled-in crater, a man who had wandered 11 universes without ever once being asked to stay finally for the first time was whether the entity's failure here means it's finished, or whether some other universe, some other Saitama, some other version of a man too strong to need saving and too tired to know he needed staying, is even now falling through a different sky toward a different, colder reception, remains an open question. The seams between worlds are thin, and patient things have a way of trying again. But for now in this universe on this Sunday morning the coffee is warm, the omelets are free, and for the first time in longer than he can remember, Saitama isn't watching the sky for cracks. With great power comes great responsibility, and sometimes the greatest power of all is knowing when not to use it. More stories await.